Good morning. Today is May 15th, and I want to give a different sort of talk today. I usually talk about things like particular policies or particular countries. Last time it was on the Sudan and the mess there. But today I thought I would contextualize a little bit as to where we are in the state of world affairs, because a lot of what is happening in a world where really the context and the structure of the world has changed. And some of that is being bandied about by academics and policymakers, and some of it is not. So let me talk a little bit about the world we currently live in which we need to discuss various policies and countries. Now, just to backtrack without being boring, we recognize that out of the Second World War, we had the Cold War, we had what was called a bilateral power structure, United States and Russia. And then we had the end of the Cold War, and we were presumably in a unipolar world, namely the United States. And we've been drifting with the idea of a unipolar world, or at least some analysts and policymakers say that, while others say, no, we now live in a multipolar world and so forth. This sounds like a lot of sort of academic garbage, but in point of fact, it has serious implications. Now, let us also remind ourselves of I've talked about before, which is power. The idea of power we've talked about is both hard power and soft power. Hard power meaning economic and military power historically, and soft power meaning something like diplomacy, propaganda, and so on. How one discusses power nowadays also has changed slightly because, for example, with AI, artificial intelligence, and other technological development, there is some discussion as to whether these things, or having access to these things, is hard power or soft power. But without, delving into that particular issue, there certainly is a discussion right now about power and who has it and who has the capacity to exercise it. Now, on the more conservative and right side of US politics, people will point out increasingly that the US is still the most powerful country in the world because it has the strongest economy, and it also still has the strongest military. In other words, the argument is we have the hard power, and even with upcoming China and so forth, whatever one wants to say about that, the fact of the matter is, if you take stock at the moment, the US is still the militarily and economically the most powerful country in the world. Then the question of a decline of US power is sort of from the middle to the left of the political spectrum, the argument being that actually we have less influence in the world. And again, influence can come both from hard power and from so-called soft power. And while those who say the US has lost influence, and for those of us who read the newspapers and say, it does look like we have lost influence, it doesn't really matter whether it comes from hard power or soft power, but in general, the idea is influence, the sort of diplomatic and other aspects of soft power is where the US has fallen down or in disrepair or no longer carries the weight that it used to carry. Now, let's remind ourselves of other things. We have almost 200 countries in the world, and because of the Ukrainian-Russian war, it has come to our attention that the U.S. has strengthened its relationship, or if anyway, renewed it or revitalized it between the United States and Europe. That is to say, the alliance against the Russian incursion in Ukraine has strengthened our relationship with Europe, politically, militarily, and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes Canada and so forth, not just Europe, but anyway, also has been strengthened. Strengthened how? Strengthened in actually having military capacity, but also strengthened in terms of an idea that the United States and Europe, in other words, most of the West, will stick together and has the capacity to stand against incursions such as Russia. And we congratulate ourselves, and our politicians congratulate us on the fact that we are now much tighter with Europe with respect to Ukraine. Let me hasten to add, though, this is while this is true with respect to Russia and the Ukraine and the concern about Russia, this may not, in fact, be true in terms of all aspects of the U.S. and Europe being aligned in other ways. So that is that. Then we've been talking for years now about the globalization of the economy. And it is indeed the case, as we all know, that we are trading with, and aspects of our technology and everybody else's is made in bits and pieces all over the world, including China and India and Europe and the United States. And to put a car together, or even the TV together, or our iPhones together, requires bits and pieces of technology which come from all over the world. That has, leads to a certain amount of interdependence. And the idea that the Biden administration has had that maybe we're too interdependent, that is to say, we're not producing enough things of our own to keep our economy going, in the event that, for example, we all of a sudden don't have access to chips coming from China or South Korea or Taiwan or someplace else. And that's a separate discussion of trade and how to put the technology together. But it's certainly the case, as we speak now in May of 2023, that in terms of technology, in terms of trade, there is a lot of interdependence. Now, the other thing that comes or arises all the time in the case of discussion of the U.S. is that, we, unlike many countries in the world, we are on a good track because we're not an aging society. China is aging, and that's a problem for it economically and increasingly in the future of how to support an older population with a small younger population. That is true for most European countries, Japan, etc. And we pride ourselves that we are really different, and therefore this is a part of our reservoir, that we have a younger population. Let me remind you of the fact that the reason we have a younger population is not that our birth rate amongst Americans who have lived here for generations is very high. It is also very low, below 2 per couple. In other words, not full replacement, but rather our youthful population comes from immigration. And as you know, immigration is a big hassle right now in the United States. I don't want to get into the immigration issue either in the US or worldwide right now, but only to say what makes us different is the fact that we have a large immigration population, which is younger and also tends to reproduce at slightly higher numbers. So in a way, the US is unique, and in a way, it isn't unique. And we get a lot of propaganda from our government and decision makers and business people and so forth about, the virtues of our own society with respect to every other society. So that is one thing. Another track is that part of the globalization of the world, of the post-World War world, was the development of international institutions. For example, the United Nations, for example, the World Bank, for example, the International Monetary Fund, which was and their policies were meant to be both in our interest and everybody else's interest. There are now, roughly speaking, 200 countries in the world. Most of them are members of the United Nations. And it's come to the attention of even our statesmen and commentators that the international institutions made a lot of sense in the post-World War II world, and is beginning to make a lot less sense in the contemporary world because they're structurally outdated. And the fact that they're structurally outdated is with us almost every day in different ways. Let me get the International Monetary and the World Bank out of the way. There's a serious discussion now whether or not the International Monetary Fund needs to be reformed in various ways. But there was even a stronger discussion in the last year or two about the World Bank, which had as its head an American. By the way, the World Bank historically has had its head being an American, and historically the International Monetary Fund has had a European as its head. During the founding, that was agreed to, and you can imagine there are now many people in the world who think that representatives from other countries might also want to head these institutions. But that quite aside, in recent years, the World Bank has had a Trump appointee who, among other things, was a climate denier. And now the World Bank is getting a new head. He is an American of South Asian origins. His family is South Asian origin, and appointed by the Biden administration. And the hope is that the World Bank can be revitalized by dealing with contemporary issues, for example, climate change issues, and funding projects in countries that deal with climate change. But now we get to the UN, and let's deal with the central UN headquarters. As you know, the guiding, most important institution in some ways politically is the Security Council. And the Security Council has 5 members with a veto, right? France, England, Russia, United States, and China. And it's almost impossible if either Russians or Chinese or both of them together veto something, for the Security Council to play the role it ought to be played, and it was designed to play, for example, in the conflict with respect to the Ukraine. The other members of the Security Council are just there on rotation from different parts of the world. And of course, there is the argument that in order to make the UN function better, the veto ought to go away, or other countries should rotate in and out of the veto system, and there are various kinds of proposals. But no one thinks that there's any chance that the 5 countries that currently have a veto, which comes from their victory in World War II, are willing to give up the veto. So the discussion increasingly has moved, how much can you move to the General Assembly, which can vote by majority? And the idea has recently sprung up that when there is veto in the Security Council, what you can do is then ask the General Assembly to vote on the matter, so that one can move on it. And that's a serious discussion and a serious possibility to make the central part of the UN in New York a more relevant institution. But the specialized agencies are also many ways structured in an out-of-date fashion and so forth, not to mention regional organizations, and on you go. And what is really necessary is to have serious reforms of these international institutions to address the contemporary world. So let's now turn to the contemporary world. The contemporary world is that let me give you an illustration how different things have become. When the General Assembly was asked to vote on the Russian incursion in the Ukraine, 40 countries out of almost 200 abstained. And that doesn't sound like a lot of countries, but those countries represented 50% of the world's population. So half the world essentially said, we don't want anything to do with this conflict, even though the conflict potentially has serious implications for them, because the issue is it within international law and the proceedings of international law for a country to invade the sovereign territory of another country? And most countries in the world would say, no, you can't just invade us, we're a sovereign country. And still, they were unwilling to take sides in this particular issue. They just wanted out. They didn't want anything to do with it. So 2/3 of the countries of the world outside the vote of the General Assembly are essentially declaring themselves to be neutral on many issues. And the question is, with the power of the United States and with the power of Europe, how can this be? And how do you explain pokey little countries around third world countries, less developed countries in the world, all of a sudden having the courage to say, never mind what the US wants or what the West wants, we're going to not be party to these discussions. So how does one explain this? Well, there's one way to explain it, and that is to say that in point of fact, no matter what we as Americans may think, the US has radically reduced influence around the world. Why is this so? Well, because countries are recognizing that their interests and the interests of the US may not be identical, but they also feel empowered in a way that they used to not be. Even very weak countries feel empowered because they have natural resources, right? And these natural resources are wanted by the major powers. By that, I not just mean the United States and Europe, but also China, Japan, and so forth, right? Where are you going to get the ingredients, let's say lithium or gold or copper or any of the ingredients for modern industrial society? Not all of it, but many of it is lodged in so-called poor and third world countries. So they actually think they have a bargaining chip. And in the last couple of years in particular, it looks like indeed they do. And they not only have a bargaining chip, but they vote according to their bargaining chip, saying, hey guys, we don't really want anything to do with this. So is this rational? Yes, from the perspective of these countries, this is very rational. Is this the wave of the future? Probably. I mean, if you want to talk about nuclear capacity, nuclear weapons, and nuclear wars, you have one sort of discussion. If you're talking about how to order the world, whether countries should take sides in political conflicts between East and West, or between Marxist societies and non-Marxist societies, a lot of these countries simply say, well, actually, we can play both sides and maximize our interest. In that sense, there is a fundamental realignment, if you will, in the global distribution of not military power, but the capacity to make decisions based on your economic, not power per se. These countries are not economically powerful, but they have economic leverage because of their resources. So then we ask entirely different questions, which comes out in American politics all the time, is that what about our role as Americans as role models for democracy? And there, I'm afraid, we used to have a fair amount of leverage in the world as well, but we've lost that. And we've lost that in multiple ways and for multiple reasons, and we don't have enough time to discuss them all. But allow me to say that given modern technology, given iPhones, given the internet, given televisions, even in most obscure countries in the world, at least in the urban areas, people have access now to information that they didn't have access before. And part of the information is not very positive or desirable, if you see, from the perspective of the US. The US does not look as this wonderful role model for everybody to emulate. Look at the Trump administration, look at the treatment that we have of people who are poor in this country. Look at the fact that on the one hand, there are serious food issues in so many countries, but then people learn there's serious food issues in our country, undernourished children, larger percentage of women, Black women who give childbirth, losing their children, infants of poor families dying, poor medical system, poor treatment. We don't look as wonderful and as operational to the rest of the world now that the rest of the world has a keen ability to see us as we used to think. So we are very proud of our country, our democracy, our whatever. And in many ways, we have a right to be. But our flaws, and our flaws are really quite serious, and they're not really very well addressed, are now public knowledge, even in obscure places and obscure countries in the world. The other thing is that while we pride ourselves helping the world and lots of foreign aid and so forth, actually, we're not doing a very good job as a country, and the international institutions which try to substitute don't mostly have enough resources. So when there's civil conflict, let's take the Sudan, or let's take Somalia, or let's take many impoverished countries in the world. They are not really getting the help that they were hoping to get. And while we talk about, all the good deeds that we're doing, we don't really get either the credit or the appreciation because it doesn't really make itself manifest. Now, you can hastily say there's so much corruption in those countries that is also an explanation, while even the assistance that they get through aid and trade doesn't necessarily help them in the way that the target assumed. And that is also true. But it's also true that actually, when you see how much we spend on the military, how much money is wasted in the US, how much US assistance and aid is not really well targeted, and how often we fall very short in the eyes of many countries. Let's take the COVID crisis. Only 3% of the vaccinations went to the continent of Africa. That may not be something we think about every day, but that's something that leaders and people in the know in African countries know about, right? So the international structure of assistance is not working very well. Countries look after themselves in many ways, and the image of the US is badly tarnished in many ways, many of them, as you are well aware of, and I don't need to highlight. So the US as a role model for democracy, for helping other countries and so forth is badly tarnished. And then it's also the case that the economic linkages between 2/3 of the world are now fairly widespread. That is to say, the third world, quote unquote, less developed world and so forth, is heavily trading, and therefore its economy are linked, not just with the United States, but with the rest of the world. For example, Europe trade with the outside of Europe is greater than in mostly with other European countries. And that is true, for example, one of the biggest trading partners for European countries is China, right? So if Europe trades with China, why shouldn't the 2/5 of the poor world trade with China? Many countries are gotten their military hardware and support from Russia, right? And to this day, the Wagner Group is all over West Africa, is all over parts of the Horn of Africa and so forth, so that governments are getting benefits, both military and economic, both in Latin America and in Africa, and in parts of Southeast Asia, South Asia in particular, from all kinds of multi connections to the rest of the world. So that also diminishes the role and the importance of the United States. And furthermore, if the US criticizes countries and says, well, we're pulling back from trade with China and so forth, why are these countries trading with China? The answer is, well, look at Europe. Look at Latin America. Look at countries that you are allied with. Look at democratic countries. They're all trading with China and other countries. So the interconnectedness of the world, and in a sense, the globalization of the economy, has also made the US and its assertions that people ought to look at us and we're the most important country and we should tell countries what to do, has had a really diminishing effect in the US recently. Now, in some senses, does this matter? That is to say, if most European countries and many countries in Latin America, if their dominant trading partners are, let's say, with China and for example, then of course, as I said, why should Africa and Latin America not also be trading with China? So that is one thing. But it's also diminished the leverage that the US has. So what I'm essentially arguing for is that we're somewhat delusional as Americans of taking pride in ourselves, which in many ways we have a right to do, but not recognizing to what extent, number one, countries around the world and leaders around the world can see flaws in our system. Second, we used to be at the forefront of preaching and being the role model for democracy, and that doesn't look so great right now, right? And third, while most of the world no longer has democratic governments, I mean, they may have elections, but when the governments in power aren't particularly democratic, other democracies in the world, like in Europe, are saying, well, that's too bad, and we should encourage democracy and hope the autocracies go away eventually, but we might as well deal with them. Because if we don't deal with them, we're going to have less influence, right? So in that sense, while we bemoan, and I certainly bemoan, the fact that so few people in the world are governed by democratic regimes and are governed by regimes which are A, autocratic, B, often quite violent, and C, not really moving in the direction of more participation and the sort of role model we hope to have out there, those countries can essentially say, hey, we're doing okay, and then we come along finally and say, well, but the problem is many of the countries in the world, the overwhelming majority of the world, the 80% of so-called lower income countries in the world, are plagued by corruption, right? And it's not just that they have autocracies, but the elites are corrupt. And the billionaires, whether it's an Indian billionaire or a Nigerian billionaire, billionaires are in fact determining not only the economy, but the politics. And of course, we would like to say that, resources and income ought to be distributed more fairly. And then people look at the US and say, hey, you know, does the US really have such a fair distribution of economic well-being? Is it not full of millionaires and billionaires, and they often determine elections? In other words, even though I don't want to argue we're as bad as those countries, what I want to argue is us playing a role model for how to do things better, how to have fairer society, how to not discriminate, how not to have poverty, how to have a better education system, and so on. Has our situation has tarnished sufficiently for reasons that we all know and are obvious, that us leaders, let us say, or opposition leaders in the third world and in the 80% of the world have a hard time saying, hey, we can do this better, or we're not worse than they are. So the sad truth of the matter is that we are living in a very beleaguered world right now, and a world in which the democratic industrial countries have less power, have less influence, and are in many ways in decline as role models and in decline as folks that really care about the rest of the world. And finally, let me make one comment there. Everyone in industrial countries and less industrial countries is aware that the future of our particular century has to do with climate change, right? And even there, all the forces that I've talked about are at play. The poor countries of the world point out that they have contributed maybe 4 or 5% of the world's population, right? The world's pollution, right? And at the same time, when they're asking for help, because they're the victims, much more so than we are, of climate change, we are being very conservative and very guarded. By we, I mean the West, I mean the United States, in helping those countries overcome the disaster that most of them are confronting. If you turn on the news today, you can see the flooding in South Asia, you can see the droughts everywhere in many countries in the world, and they have no real way of coping with it unless they get some serious help. And yet we, meaning the industrial countries, go to climate change conferences and are very conservative in the amount of help we want to offer. And that, by the way, very much grades in the rest of the world. We are the victims of climate change, and yet you folks are unwilling to really give us the kind of help we need to overcome the existing climate change and what's ahead. So in many ways, we have lost leverage, and we have lost the admiration of many of the peoples in the world, not entirely, and certainly not of some of the educated elite. But I think we need to consider that we're living in a very different world, and that the decline of Western influence and American influence has to be seriously taken into account as we think about the present and the future. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 weeks.